And at this time, I'll ask, though, before we get started, a few comments from Co-Chair DeSalen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair McKenney. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I know it's just the start of session, but this is an issue that's important to a lot of members of both of these committees. Nearly everyone has signed on to one letter or another relating to homelessness as it has played out and been laid bare in the state of Rhode Island. I work at an agency called Justice Assistance, where we deal with a number of different issues, including the rehousing of individuals that have involvement in the criminal justice system. Every morning we start our day with an affirmation to center ourselves, and I thought of no better way to start this hearing the day after MLK weekend, day after MLK Day, than with a quote from Robert Kennedy, who the day after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination said, "But perhaps we can remember, if only for a day, that those who live with us are our brothers, that they share with us the same short moment of life." And I know that that is a spirit that guides a lot of the folks who do the work day in and day out that will testify before us today, and I thank you for that work. But the sad reality is that decades of poor policymaking, decades of underinvestment have led to a true housing crisis in the state of Rhode Island, a crisis where there's been a year-over-year 35% increase in the number of individuals experiencing homelessness, a crisis where we need 24,000 units of affordable housing, a crisis where 150,000 households are cost burdened as it relates to housing, 72,000 of those being renters. As an individual who represents the capital city, that is a particular concern for me and my colleagues in the Providence delegation. The reality is that we are in this situation because year after year, a number of things have gone wrong, not the least of which is per capita development of new units has been last in the nation. Just to keep pace with natural housing growth, we're expected to add about 2,000 units a year. That doesn't account for the housing crisis that I just briefly illustrated in those facts above. So I want to thank everyone for starting this session on the right foot, beginning with a discussion on housing, which I believe, along with, as many have also alluded to in the Senate, our healthcare crisis is really an issue that is front and center for us to deal with this session. So I welcome the conversation. I look forward to hearing from all of you, and I really do want to thank you for the work that you do day in and day out.
Thank you, Co-Chair. A few comments I'd like to make as well. A number of folks have questioned why we need to have a hearing of this type, and that this is somewhat of an adversarial proceeding, something that could have been done quietly without the need for a hearing. Well, I've noted to those people, and I'll say here, the Senate has an obligation to do oversight, and we do it publicly because there are questions out there, many of which come from our colleagues and constituents, and frankly, people are entitled to answers. And moreover, this doesn't have to be adversarial, and we're not looking to make it adversarial. I was a trial lawyer for over 40 years. I know what adversarial is. This is not. We're looking for answers to some questions that I think have to be asked. And I have suggested this is really an opportunity. The fact that people have questions is indicative of another fact that for whatever reason, they're not fully aware of what's happening in the housing world. And so this is an opportunity to give them a better understanding of that. And I will note this, Rhode Islanders are frustrated. They look at government these days and they consider it as failing to move faster than a snail's pace. And so, and too often, that kind of criticism is warranted. I think people have viewed such things as the pilot shelter as emblematic of that. A failure of government, just a kind of lengthy, dawdling inability to solve a problem that is facing a severe need. And so I think when we look at other places that deal with similar types of projects and do it quickly, do it in 100 days or whatever, it begs the question, why aren't we doing better here? And so our job is really to look at that situation, hope it's going to be resolved as soon as possible, but also to find out what we can learn from it to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think in a similar way, Rhode Islanders are concerned, given the historic expenditure of funds and the fact that we've got another 120 million in the bond that was just approved, are we expending those funds in a way that's appropriate? Again, doing it at the kind of pace that unfortunately government is not always known for. But we look at reports coming out that talk in terms of 24,000 units needed to close Rhode Island's gap of affordability. And the increase in affordability problems, homelessness, especially since 2020, due in large part to the lack of housing production. And that's been a problem for many years. But of course, that high cost and the scarcer availability of housing generally has played a role in creating the tight and expensive rental market as well. So all of those things are things we're hoping to hear from you folks on. And with that said, Ms. Wilcox, you're welcome to start.
Thank you very much. I'm Michelle Wilcox, President and CEO of Crossroads Rhode Island. I'm joined by my colleague, John McDonald, who is Crossroads Chief Program Officer. Thank you all very much for the invitation to be here today. So we'll start with a little bit of context. According to HUD's latest point-in-time count, which is a year old, I would mention, homelessness has more than doubled over the last 5 years, reaching a record high in Rhode Island. If you're not familiar with it, the point-in-time count is a federally mandated census that occurs on a single night in January. Volunteers go out and literally count the number of people experiencing homelessness. This year's point-in-time count will be conducted tonight. So these numbers that you see here are probably conservative. The very nature of the count means that people get missed. I do feel that the point-in-time count provides a reasonably accurate snapshot of homelessness in Rhode Island. I'd also like to point out that these numbers are reflective of just a single night. Over the course of an entire year, the total number of people experiencing homelessness is probably 2 to 3 times of that what the PIP count number is. And I can honestly say that in my 30 plus years in homelessness services, I have never seen the level of people experiencing homelessness that we are experiencing in Rhode Island today. Homelessness absolutely has reached a crisis point in our state. So why is this happening? What's different now is really a perfect storm of insufficient housing supply, rapidly escalating rents, and wages that are failing to keep up with inflation. More and more people are being priced out of stable homes, including people who have steady jobs and people who have never been homeless before. State and local governments have made significant investments in housing and homeless services, but they haven't been able to keep pace with the rising demand. The end result is that overall homelessness increased 35% from 2023 to 2024. Even more concerning, the number of people sleeping outside has risen about 400% over the last 5 years. Let me put that into perspective for you. Before the pandemic, almost no one in Rhode Island was sleeping outside. We had one of the lowest unsheltered homeless rates in the country. Today, there are literally hundreds, about 650 people who are currently sleeping outside in freezing temperatures and in places not fit for human habitation. I think that we can all agree that that is not okay. And finally, because we don't have enough housing, the length of time that people are experiencing homelessness is increasing, which is driving chronic homelessness. So the 2024 point-in-time count called out Rhode Island as having the second highest percentage increase of chronic homelessness in the country. It's worth noting that the face of homelessness is also changing. When I first started in this business, the majority of people experiencing homelessness were white men. As you can see from this data, however, it's really changing. More than 500 children under the age of 18 experienced homelessness in Rhode Island last year. The number of men and women who are homeless is now almost equal. And while whites still account for almost half of our homeless population, people of color make up a disproportionate percentage. So a little bit about Crossroads. As the state's leading provider of housing and services for those experiencing homelessness, Crossroads is on the front lines addressing Rhode Island's homelessness crisis. Our mission is to help people experiencing homelessness secure stable homes, because we know that the only solution to homelessness is housing. To meet the needs of the thousands of people who experience homelessness in our community every year, Crossroads provides a range of housing-focused programs and services. So during weather extremes like we've had lately, we operate as a warming center. Our community room, located at our headquarters building on Broad Street in Providence, can provide up to 35 people with a place to stay warm. And when that room reaches capacity, as it did last week, we can expand capacity to our dining room. We will not turn anyone away, but I will say that last night we had 72 people in those two rooms, and we are getting close to our capacity. As a short-term solution, Crossroads currently operates 5 separate temporary emergency shelters with more than 250 beds across the state. These include Harrington Hall, the state's largest shelter for men, a women's shelter, a family shelter, a domestic violence shelter, and the Hartford Avenue shelter, which is the state's only shelter for adult couples without children. Because so many people are currently experiencing homelessness, however, all of our shelters are full. As I said, housing is the only solution for ending homelessness, and our primary focus is on helping our clients secure safe, stable, and affordable housing. To ensure our ability to do that, Crossroads owns and manages more than 375 permanent supportive apartments statewide. We also maintain strong working relationships with private landlords for market rate rentals. To help people maintain their housing and work towards achieving financial independence, we also provide education and employment programs which help people earn their GED and gain new skills and employment. So as a result of all of that, Crossroads served nearly 5,600 men, women, and children last year. Of those, we helped more than 2,400 at-risk individuals and families either prevented or quickly ended their homelessness using housing problem solving. About 1,530 found a safe place to stay at one of the 5 shelters that I just described. And more importantly, we helped more than 2,500 people end their homelessness by either finding a new place to call home or by maintaining housing in one of our permanent supportive housing programs. Of those, 333 households received up to 24 months of rental assistance and case management support through our rapid rehousing program, which allowed them to move into market rate units statewide. Another 743 households moved into permanent supportive housing, primarily properties that Crossroads owns and manages. These apartments are deeply subsidized, allowing for extremely low or no income residents to live safely with the housing-based services and supports they need for as long as they need. So to meet the growing need, Crossroads is currently creating nearly 300 permanent supportive apartments in Providence, including the Summer Street Apartments, which is currently well underway. When complete in the fall of 2025, later this year, more than 176 formerly homeless adults will be able to move into beautiful and affordable new 1-bedroom apartments, each with their own beautiful kitchen, living area, and private bathroom. The Summer Street Apartments will also feature community gathering space on every floor, outdoor green space for clients to enjoy, and easy access to healthcare, transportation, and employment. And as part of Crossroads' ongoing commitment to sustainability, our new 5-story apartment building will have a net zero impact. A diverse range of green building practices are being used during construction, and a combination of on and off-site renewable energy will support 100% of the building's energy needs. Coming soon is 371 Pine Street. This is a first of its kind in Rhode Island housing apartment building for medically vulnerable adults experiencing homelessness. We're planning to break ground on this innovative apartment building this spring with an expected completion in late 2026. In addition to 35 fully accessible apartments, 371 Pine Street will also feature a beautiful healing garden and ground floor offices for Crossroads staff and healthcare provider partners. And also in the pipeline is the much needed renovation of our Travelers Aid housing at 160 Broad Street, sometimes called the Tower. We hope to begin these renovations in 2026. And when complete in 2027, 81 new much needed 1-bedroom and studio apartments, each with a kitchen, bath, and living area, will be added to the state's inventory of permanent supportive apartments. As part of this effort, we also recently repointed all of the brick on our more than 100-year-old building. And later this week, we hope to complete the installation of new exterior lighting and signage. Later this spring, we'll begin creating some new outdoor green space to give our residents a safe and private place to spend time outside. And in addition to these three development efforts, Crossroads continues to evaluate other properties on an ongoing basis as part of our continued efforts to help those experiencing homelessness in our community secure stable housing. So before I close, I just want to talk about some trends that we've been seeing. And it may help inform how we handle homelessness in Rhode Island moving forward. So we are seeing a significant increase in the number of people with income who are entering our programs. In many cases, people who are working 1 or 2 jobs, but who still can't afford rent. And our housing problem solving team tells us that the lack of sufficient income to afford rents is the #1 reason why folks are finding themselves homeless. An interesting note also, an increasing number of seniors are experiencing homelessness. We view this as an emerging trend and expect this number to continue to grow given the size of the baby boomer generation. The number of families experiencing homelessness is also on the rise, most of them led by a single mom with multiple young children. When I first started in this business, people experiencing homelessness were almost always adults and predominantly male, and that is just no longer the case. And the last trend that we're seeing is complexity. The trauma and stress of poverty and homelessness leads to increased rates of chronic conditions such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and also contributing to mental health and substance use issues. Dealing with highly complex cases requires a different skill set than we often have on staff. To meet the need, we have been piloting partnerships with local healthcare providers such as Lifespan and others, and we see significant benefit in expanding that type of partnership moving forward. So I've just given you a fair amount of information, so I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions along with John that you may have, anything we can clarify.
Chair Basela?
Just one contestant. Looks like who does it and process?
The count is overseen by the Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness, and so there's folks better informed than I. I can say that it takes a large number of volunteers and staff from all of the various providers. So the count happens across the state, and there's a huge number of people that will participate to count as close as possible every person experiencing homelessness, whether they are sheltered in one of our emergency temporary shelters or unsheltered. And the count will actually happen tonight, but it will take place over this week, beginning tonight, so that when folks come to, say, soup kitchens or other social service agencies in the next few days, they will be asked where they spent the night to night, so that we can get as accurate a count as possible. Laura, would you add anything to that?
Absolutely. I would just add two parts on the front end and the back end. So the point in time count is a requirement of HUD. So everyone across the country right now is going to be counting people experiencing homelessness this week. And so that is so that we can get somewhat of an equitable playing field, right, of where everyone is all across the nation. As Michelle mentioned, yes, it counts both folks that are accessing shelter beds right now and the people that are outside. Then there is a process that information gets deduplicated, so to make sure that we're not counting Laura twice and Michelle 3 times, because we might see someone at a shelter tonight and then they show up for lunch somewhere the next day. So that is all untangled. That methodology is also followed in best practice with HUD and is also shared back. And then that information does get transmitted once it's all collated and completed, and HUD runs through it. And then typically those numbers come out in the spring, early summer, depending. And that helps. The reason why the point in time count, or PIT, is so important is also because that informs what the need looks like in a snapshot moment as best as we possibly can, given the transient nature of folks that are experiencing homelessness. And it will inform grant funding opportunities on the housing side, so that we can develop and support housing on an ongoing basis through PSH and other methods. So it's a really important moment.
Thank you. Thanks.
Senator DeMario?
Thank you, Chairman. So just regarding the count, does that also include families who are currently housed in hotels by DCYF?
Yes, thank you, everyone. And again, as best as we can, so it's working with sort of that main core of homeless shelter providers, then other places where people might access soup kitchens, food pantries, and then other partner agencies like DCYF and others that are working collaboratively, or even the VA.
Senator Mack?
Thank you, and thank you all for your work. I have done the point-in-time contact twice now on some of the coldest nights. It is a very hard count to do because you see just how cold it is when you are out in below freezing temperatures. One of the questions I have is how is the point-in-time contact information that you use every year used to inform how many shelter beds or emergency beds that you have on nights like tonight where the temperatures will be dangerous for folks to be outside?
So there's a bit of a disconnect, I would say, between the point in time count and the number of shelter beds that exist in Rhode Island. The availability of shelter is to a large extent a function of the funding that is available, and not necessarily the correlated response to the number of people who are experiencing homelessness.
Thank you.
Senator Collin?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about, so the 35 permanent supportive beds for medically vulnerable adults, how does that map onto the need? I understand this is not, a thing that we're expecting you to do tomorrow, but that's a good start. And also, if we were to map it onto how many people are actually in need of services like that, how would you estimate that?
It is a start, and I would say that the need is much greater than the 35 apartments that we are currently have in the pipeline. This particular program, this particular property, has been in pre-development and feasibility with Crossroads for a number of years. It predates the pandemic. So going back to 2018, 2019, we were talking about trying to develop a program such as this. Ironically, it is thanks to the pandemic and funding that came through COVID relief that we were able to acquire the site where we're building this particular housing. So it is first of its kind in Rhode Island, and I expect that we will see some really good results as a result of building and occupying it. We have a partnership in place already with Brown University Health for some of the units, and so it will be the foundation on which we can hopefully build more.
Follow up? Sure.
Yes, thank you. And can I just ask you to estimate if how 35 here? What's the need? I'm not going to hold you to this. I'm trying to get a sense of scale.
3-4 times.
Yeah, I would say hundreds.
Senator Acosta?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. Loosely related to that last question, you mentioned the process of getting this project completed. So my back of the hand calculation suggests you have about 300, just shy of 300 units in the pipeline over the next 2 calendar years. Can you talk to me about how close to kind of signed, sealed, and delivered these projects are? And so, are they gone through the financing process fully? Have they gone through the permitting process? Are those still things that are coming?
Sure, thank you. So the Summer Street Apartments is under construction. It's fully financed, permitted, and construction will be complete in September of this year. The Pine Street, 371 Pine Street Health and Housing is also, the financing is all of the financing is in place. The financing for that project is actually a combination of funds, public funds through Rhode Island Housing and the State Department of Housing, and private philanthropy funds that Crossroads has raised through a capital campaign. And we have all of our approvals from the city to begin construction. So the demolition of the existing building on the site will take place as soon as all of the power lines have been moved that need to get out of the way for us to knock down the building. But all of the approvals that we need are in place. The third project, the Travelers Aid Housing, we do not have the financing in place yet. We have applied for those funds, but that application is still pending, and then we will go through the permitting process as well.
Sure, certainly, Senator.
Thank you. And just to follow up, when you say you've applied for the funding, who have you applied to, and when do you expect to hear? And outside of these projects, do you have any others, or is this kind of your portfolio right now?
Thank you. So the funding that we have applied for Travelers Aid Housing is through Rhode Island Housing through the application process called the One Stop. So it's low-income housing tax credits and other ancillary financing. We submitted our application to Rhode Island Housing last month in December, and would expect that they will make funding decisions in April or May of this year. And we have one other project that is in very early stages of development, which would be a family housing, new family housing in Warwick, Rhode Island, but we're still in sort of the early feasibility stage of that project. Thank you, Senator. We're always in the process of looking at opportunities and locations for more housing.
Thank you. And Ms. Wilcox, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for all that Crossroads does. I have a couple questions pertaining to the unit cost. It's concerning to see folks tell us that while we need 24,000 units, we're on pace to build about 1,600 for the $275 million historic outlay. It just seems that some of the unit costs, as we look at, for example, the RIPEC report that came out in October, are off the wall, 400,000 plus per unit. So I'm curious, when I look at Summer Street, Pine Street, and Travelers Aid, what you folks are doing in terms of ballpark unit costs.
Yes, it is expensive to build housing and to build it well and ensure that it is sustainable for the long term. So I think, one of the things when we talk about unit costs on affordable housing is recognizing that we build things into our housing that you're not going to see necessarily in the private market. Reserves to ensure that the property is well maintained and is sustainable for decades to come. And the sheer diversity of the funds that come into affordable housing development, the Summer Street Apartments had 24 separate sources of funds in the capital stack, and every one of those had its own set of regulations and rules, and so it's complicated, to put it mildly. Our per unit cost is on par with what you might have heard. We were in the, I think, $430,000 per unit. And again, a lot of that is driven by the cost of construction, costs of construction, you know, our
I
projected
don't have
cost for
any,
some
I mean,
street
and
doubled
so
during the
I think,
pandemic.
and also,
that was
my
a
other
function not
disagreement is
of
their
the fact that it was affordable
both
housing, it
sides
was a
of it.
function
You know,
of
they
what was
call it
happening in the
neutrality,
market.
but really is both
So,
sides of it.
a lot
And-
of the changes that we've seen in the last couple of years were really market driven.
Okay, and I'll ask this probably of everyone at some point, but we've also heard some criticism of doing 100% affordability, and it's a suggestion that we should have more mixed income. What is your sense of that? And what are these? Are these all 100%?
Yes, the properties that Crossroads develops have traditionally been 100% affordable for people experiencing homelessness. So we're unique in that our housing is exclusively for folks who have experienced homelessness. I'd say that a healthy housing market needs a healthy mix of all kinds. And so while this is what Crossroads does, there are other developers that provide housing that is more of a mix of income types and household types, and that's what creates a healthy housing market. So I think there is room for and need for all of it in our housing market.
Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Wilcox? Then we'll proceed to Ms. Goddard.
Secretary Goddard, welcome to the committee hearing. If you could just state your name for the record before you start your presentation, as well as the gentleman who's joining you to your right, although he's no stranger to this room.
Good afternoon, my name is Deborah Goddard, and I'm joined today by,
Dan Connors. Good afternoon, chairs and honorable senators. Daniel Connors served as a brief period as the acting Secretary of Housing immediately preceding Secretary Goddard, and it's been a few minutes since I've had the pleasure of being in this room. Thank you.
so this is the first time I'm meeting most of you, so I'd like just to take a moment to introduce myself briefly. I have spent 40 years in the area of housing and homelessness, largely, almost entirely in the public sector, a little bit in the nonprofit sector. It's a choice I've made. It's something I knew I was going to do from high school, and I have felt fortunate to be able to do work with what my passion is. I'm particularly interested in the issues of equity and opportunity in housing for every individual, every household, regardless of their income or their other demographic factors. I hope I'll have the chance to show you that my manner is generally very straightforward, sometimes too straightforward. I believe in, I work for, I foster, I value collaboration and partnership. It's the only way to get the work done. I'm open to debate, to questions, discussion, new ideas. It's the only way we all learn. It's the only way we improve our systems. So that's a little bit about how I approach my work, and I hope I have a chance to show it to Rhode Island. I'm very excited about the opportunity to work in Rhode Island, and for the department. We have a good team at the department, and I want the department genuinely to succeed in its mission. So with that, we will just start moving through, and this is a fairly dense PowerPoint. I might skip over some of the slides. You have all of it, and feel free to ask me to pause, ask me questions. So again, I think you understand generally that the department works in the arena of housing policy and planning, production and preservation, homelessness services, housing assistance, and community development, actually the forerunner of the department, the Office of Housing and Community Development. We'll get to it in a minute, but part of, we say we're in all these arenas, but there are other players in these arenas too. So we don't own these, and the lack of clarity can sometimes create an issue. Homelessness response. There are a number of players, and this is critical to understanding how we all mesh and sometimes don't mesh. So we've got the Department of Housing. We oversee the Consolidated Homeless Fund. We are the lead agency for housing and homelessness per statute, but you probably find that language in other statutes for other organizations as well. This year, last year, more than $30 million was allocated to us that we put out for homeless providers, shelters, and services. There's the Rhode Island Continuum of Care. This is a creature of federal law. It's a 17-member board. It manages and implements over $17 million in continuum of care funds from the federal government. By law, it is the entity that designates who manages the coordinated entry system, as well as the homeless information management system, HMIS and CES. And it conducts planning activities for the homelessness response. Then there's the Interagency Council on Homelessness, established by state law. It had been dormant for about 8 years. We resurrected it in December, just had a meeting. We'll have a meeting next week, I believe, in January, and continue thereon monthly for several months to come. This really is an attempt to bring all of the state agencies together to really speak to the role and the capacity and the ability of these agencies, whether it's Department of Health, Department of Elder Services, VA, contribute to addressing the issues of homelessness. Where are we losing people? Folks that are homeless generally have touched our system somewhere. Where have they touched the system? How often have they touched the system? Where did we lose them? Where could we have helped them not fall through the system? So I think the Interagency Council is extremely important. And again, when we get to governance, you'll see we've made recommendations about strengthening it. Important consideration, I know you're all concerned about this, is the recurring funding streams for homelessness. The existing Emergency Solutions Grant, generally known as ESG, Title 20, again, federal funds, and then the Restricted Receipts Account from the HRC. Going forward, as you know, the governor has proposed 2 new recurring funding sources, the whole home rental tax and the conveyance tax increase for homes above $800,000 in value. You also know we have had a tremendous influx of funding through the SFRF program. This governor really allocated a tremendous amount of money out of the SFRF funding, as did the legislature, thank you, for homelessness infrastructure, homelessness assistance. This is one-time funding. This is the cliff we all knew we were going to face, and it's going to hit us. Not fully this year. We still have SFRF funding to spend, but it is coming at us. Total available shelter beds from 2020 to the present. Here's a little bit of history about as beds started coming on. You can see the dramatic increase when SFRF funds began flowing in 22. We got up to 1346 last year. We expect to be, and I work towards maintaining that number between shelter beds and emergency hub beds. We may have a few more coming on later in the year as well. Homelessness dashboard, we've been asked by the governor and others to put something up on our website explaining utilization of the shelter system. We're finalizing it. It should be up next week. So we will get information from the Coalition to End Homelessness. They are the HMIS, the data center for this. We will post it. This is a matter of trying to be more transparent, provide information in alternate settings. And we'll also have information on our emergency winter hubs and a link to the coordinated entry system for people who are experiencing homelessness. It will be available on our website. So what was our strategy for the Consolidated Homeless Fund in 25? First, to maximize existing emergency shelter capacity. A lot of this obviously predates me, so if Dan wants to chime in, he can, but I will keep on my roll for a moment. And as you saw on the previous slide, we did maintain, at least for now, the shelter capacity that we created in the prior year. We also wanted to strengthen homelessness prevention and response through performance management. Michelle spoke to housing problem solving, and we really want to measure how our providers are preventing people from entering the homeless situation. If they're there, how are they finding an alternate stable housing situation? That may be shelter in the short run, but it may be back home, it may be a new apartment, everything that Michelle referenced. We want to measure what each of our providers doing, particularly as we know we're going to face tighter fiscal times. We need to make sure our dollars are doing what we all want them to do, which is maximize safe, secure shelter/housing for every resident of Rhode Island. We had one application deadline for new projects rather than staggered, which has happened in the past. We also offered that folks could just decide they wanted to extend their contract, not a lot of hoopla in applying for new funds. We did also offer that if folks wanted to come in for just extended winter capacity, we would accept those applications. We didn't get any, but I think it's linked to the fact that based on provider input, this year, and this is why you're not going to see a spike, we haven't heard about a spike in additional beds. We kept the beds that opened up for winter last year open year round. That was a request from providers, stop it up and down, up and down. And as we face climate change in summers, it's all the more important that we have shelter in summer as well as winter. So that's why you may not have seen a spike in winter availability. The beds were already online. Nope. So we're investing $32 million this year. Here's a breakout. I'm not going to read it. You have it, but it is emergency shelter, the biggest chunk, rapid rehousing, problem solving, outreach, services, and systems. The systems being largely the CES and HMIS. Again, winter readiness for this year. We've been asked about it. So again, we expanded shelter capacity and maintained it from last year. We did want to expand winter-specific capacity. We put out a municipal homelessness support initiative. We received 2 responses. We funded both of them, both in Woonsocket. We've also tried to partner with municipalities for emergency hubs, again, through homelessness support initiative. So they open, these are the emergency hubs, hubs for very dry, that's my dry mouth, adverse winter conditions. And we have 3, West Warwick, Westerly, and Woonsocket, 2 open. They have not gotten their building permits yet. And again, government has come together to help support us. We did have REMA warming centers, and we're tracking them. We have a REMA staff person embedded with us who's been a great help to create that conversation back and forth between our departments. And as I've mentioned, we reconvened the Interagency Council in January. As you all know, we are also using state property to address homelessness with a focus on families. So we have 4 properties. At Zambarano campus, we have capacity for 30 families. At Kingston Family Shelter, another 30 families. At Hartford Avenue, 40 for couples. And at Randall, 100 Randall, known as Charlesgate, we have shelter for families and coming online, not yet open, older adults. Everyone has questions, understandably, about the department and how we can improve department operations. In terms of staffing in the department itself, it's been my priority to stand up the department as quickly as possible. We've been moving our postings. We are moving through resumes. We are scheduling interviews. We are dealing with not having filled in the past. We're also dealing with normal turnover. But as I've said to my staff, I care deeply about management. I care deeply that the organization is set up to succeed, and that has been my priority. We also, in terms of the calendar for putting out our homeless funds, we want to revise the calendar so that the application is going out in the spring rather than summer, which is not a great time of year for folks to be responding, and would make it more likely that we will make awards in summer and contracts will be in place by mid-September before the current contracts expire. Housing governance, I'm gonna skip this. You know, you wrote the statute, you wanted a housing governance report, so I'm gonna skip that. This has been a good solid process.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Secretary. We can skip that for now because I think it's probably going to
Okay,
be very derivative exercise, but is it safe to say maybe that statute needs some tweaking as we move forward to realign the housing functions throughout our state if we're going to have a Department of Housing?
yes, you're right, that there are places we need, and we will be working with you on legislation to put those recommendations in place.
Probably a longer hearing, right?
Yes. I'll just skip forward to how it relates to, I was going to get to how it relates to homelessness. Some key things there, again, reestablishing the Interagency Council on Homelessness, suggesting that the continuum of care might move over to the department, end state recommendation. Nothing's going to happen overnight. We have to do things in a very thoughtful way. Again, no chaos, and clear lines of communication in all of this. I think that's important. So, Echo Village, ahead of Laura, very quick facts, 54 units, as you've heard from others, a very new type of product and program, and really have to almost think of it as a development project, versus a quick hit with a tent or a pop-up. It wasn't that. There are also some things at the outset that folks may not be aware of. This was DOT-owned land. So when we decided on the site, there was a transfer process that had to involve the federal government. Then there was site remediation, fill, before we could start the real work. You all know that there was a process with DVR and the fire marshal and the building commissioner. New product, didn't fit in the code. I've been asked in the past if we should have waived the code. I don't think anyone on our side, and collectively our side, wanted to be rash in moving on how we address the fire code issues. Thank you. And you can see that once the building permit was issued, in June of 24, about midway across the slide, we've had work going on nonstop, and we will be opening, I keep saying this winter, we will be opening this winter. I've not given a date in the past because we've disappointed so many people, but I would say probably 3 to 4 weeks we will be opening. Laura will talk more, but she's already moving furniture back in. She's training staff. We are in the stages of final inspection there. Final work, electrification, testing, final inspections. Fire and building are working together to coordinate the inspections so they're not sequential, but they're happening at the same time. There may be some additional site work you'll see after it opens, but of course we don't wait for spring for landscape and there will be a dog run, but that won't hold us up from opening. So that is what I wanted to convey. I'm obviously open to questions, expect questions, and look forward to discussing.
30% at the top, and those 30% tend to be in the season.
Questions? Senator Murray.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I want to go back to your slide that showed expanding winter-specific capacity, and I'm very happy to see Woonsocket on there. This is a district that I represent. As you probably know, we have at least 100, maybe more, unhoused folks at any given time. When did that? It's my understanding that the SRF initiative was put out in September, and that Woonsocket applied in September. However, they did not receive notice until January 3rd that they had been accepted for these.
I'm going to ask Ben Hayne to come up here quickly.
Are you referring to the municipal?
Excuse me, sir, could you just state your name and
Sure.
title for the record? Sorry about that.
My name is Benjamin Haney. Are you referring to the municipal support grants?
Right, to expand the winter capacity for Woonsocket. And if you could just, if you wouldn't mind, just making sure that you're heard into the microphone, please. Just so the folks online can hear you.
Sure. Yeah, so a letter of intent was sent out to providers and the contracts were sent out this past week, I believe.
Right.
And
So,
when did the RFP go out?
That one opened, I believe, in September.
Yeah.
okay. So the RFP opened in September. I know that Woonsocket applied in September and they were awarded on January 3rd. So we knew the cold weather was coming, and you know I have a lot of concerns around that. So the emergency need, you know, for shelter for families, as well as individuals, we know that, you know, that looks a lot different now than it did, as was stated. What is your plan to make sure that we can get these emergency shelter beds in a more timely manner? You know, the providers have said, you know, that this is urgent, that and overall that like the billing process has become more onerous. There are a lot of like really smaller providers, particularly in Woonsocket, that cannot afford, you know, to go to go quarterly, to be reimbursed. You know, these are the people who are out working in the community, and they're smaller organizations. And to just speak to like that reimbursement process and how you see that we can better streamline that to help these organizations provide immediate resources for people who are unhoused.
Sure. First of all, it is urgent all the way around. I agree. I'm not sure how they got there this past year. I know they were understaffed, but that's not the whole answer. So my answer to you is we are staffing up. We're looking for a spring start of the cycle for RFPs. And we have to be mindful. What's that end date? And let's build back. So my genuine pledge is we will not be here again next year.
Thank you.
Senator Basalan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Is there a way that we could go back to, I think, slides 6 and 7, specifically the one that talks about recurring funding streams for homelessness, and then the partitioned, or some may say siloed, state approach to dealing with homelessness? First, I want to commend the governor for identifying some recurring funding streams for this issue, which has only grown worse over the years, specifically the conveyance tax, which I know Senator Coleman, I think, had legislation a number of years ago to begin a recurring investment in the Housing Production Fund. So this is not new. But when I look at the slide that has, what I'll say, 3 panels, and in the middle of it, I see the Rhode Island Continuum of Care, a function that's nested at Rhode Island Housing, so to speak, along with approximately, it looks like $17.3 million in, I guess, one would consider federal funds. And then on the left panel, what I see is how the state appropriated SRFF funds to the department. Is that correct? In the amount of a little bit over $30 million to deal with essentially the same issue. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what I see here,
Yeah, it sucks.
is not necessarily an alignment of housing policy, but certainly a redundancy maybe in capacity building, and maybe a bit of inefficiency. But I know that you're the professional. Could you maybe expand on that, and if that observation is correct?
I would say yes to all 3 aspects of your observation. The continuum of care is created by federal law. I've always considered it sort of ethereal. It operates out there. not too accountable to anyone but itself. But again, this goes back to the recommendation that the department be made the joint applicant for the federal funds, and that is no slight on Rhode Island Housing. They've done a fantastic job of getting this $17 million.
There was nowhere else to put the COC, theoretically.
Right. But again, that idea of consolidating policy development and programming under the department speaks to this. It will always have its own, COC will always have, well, as it's currently created under federal law, will always have its own, life and independence, but we can do more to bring it in line. Its funding recommendations, for instance, and we also recommend could be affirmed by the Interagency Council on Homelessness, instead of a separate advisory committee that has existed but hasn't really met. I'm making it sound even more disjointed because it is even more disjointed.
But is it fair to say that the COC could be nested anywhere? It's merely just something that needs to exist so that we can access those HUD funds to respond to homelessness?
Yes.
Or be prepared to
Yes.
respond to homelessness?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, just being thoughtful in how and when we do it.
Right. I mean, it certainly seems like, whether we want it to be a Rhode Island Housing or the Department of Housing, pick one, right? So there's not necessarily that that dual alignment, but rather a streamlined alignment, a vision where we know exactly who to work with and hold accountable as it relates to the state's approach to this issue, which has been laid bare over the last month.
I like that word accountable, and I'm always upset with gray areas or Venn diagrams because you don't know how to hold accountable, and that leads to problems.
Is it fair to say that when we allocated that $30 million that there was a significant amount of capacity building that had to occur at the department just to do it?
Yes, it was, at the time, I don't even think the department was fully up or named yet, right? It came in January 1, 23. It was the Office of Housing Community Development, staff that had been running the emergency, the federal funds. So yes, it needed to get up and running. We did that by bringing in some consultants, and there were some, not me, folks that were more experienced in homelessness, and we started ramping up, but it was a heavy lift.
And I think that maybe just by divvying it up too, it probably makes it tough to be a provider as well, because they have a few different places to go to. So it's no slight on anyone. Seriously, if anything, it's a slight on state government and the idea of buying the cart before you've even identified the horses. So I have no further questions, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Senator DeMario.
Thank you. This is somewhat of a related question to the chairman's. You had heard me ask earlier about whether or not families who were currently being housed in hotels were counted. And my reasoning for that question was because I've been made aware of the issue where when families come to the attention of DCYF and the only concern is their lack of stable housing, DCYF is compelled through a number of different ways to put them in emergency hotel housing. At that point, it's my understanding that they then are not able to participate in the coordinated entry system because they are no longer considered homeless. And so these families, and to my understanding over the last couple of years, we've gotten to the point where there's a pretty consistent census of about 100 families, so 300 roughly people who are being housed in hotels that DCYF is paying for. And in this year's current budget, the line item for that is estimated to be about $6 million for DCYF to pay those hotel costs. And the off-ramp for those families, because they have been precluded from participating in CES, is then that the individual case managers at DCYF have to kind of try to navigate this system. And so my question is with these conversations about streamlining governance and, specifically, even this conversation with the Interagency Council, if DCYF is going to be at that table, but it just seems like another example of not an efficient system of getting those families to stable long-term housing, which would benefit the families and also would be more cost effective.
So basically this whole setup is just to ask, is that part of the conversation of, weaving together all of these different systems? And also, is there an opportunity to try to correct that policy issue with these families not being able to be streamlined into CES because they've been put in this emergency hotel housing?
First part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really great question. It's a very serious issue, I think, not only for the families experiencing homelessness, for DCYF, and for the state. I think you mentioned that through, various modes the department has been paying for hoteling, and I know it's come to really the attention of OMB, the budget office, because in many ways there were not funds specifically in the DCYF budget to address folks, families experiencing homelessness. So the response is really from the state, I think, really congruent with the concept of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. So trying to problem solve across the different departments, it was identified that the Department of Human Services has some flexibility with TANF funds. And I know, a little bit, but I don't have the granular level of detail to get down into the weeds on it. But when the TANF criteria was sort of applied against the cohort of families that were, being hoteled, there was a rather significant shift of that funding to TANF, which you would understand would be optimal rather than using, straight general revenue, which is what the department had been using. So that work has gone on. I think, in the rearview mirror, it's imperfect. I think we're trying to design a strategy going forward whereby the Department of Human Service folks are involved upstream to ask the right questions to ensure that, all the allowable expenses are captured in real time. So it's my understanding that is part of the governor's budget that he just submitted to the House last week. But that's really, I think, congruent with the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and to just take it one step further, probably a little bit more information than is necessary, but a really talented hard worker at DHS, Donna Rook, some of you may have met her, was recently elected to the Continuum of Care Board to really help bring that perspective and focus even into COC board meetings. So I don't know that the TANF solution will solve 100% of the expense. I doubt that it will, but it is going to be a real, I think, positive for the state from a general revenue perspective, and from the perspective of being able to continue to provide, temporary shelter for the most vulnerable families, is really critically important. As you can see, the amount of money that comes into homelessness, really is insufficient for, the need that's been articulated.
Senator, I think this also raises the problem again of the multiple bodies. So it is the COC that sets the policies and procedures for CES. I want to look into that. I want us to really have honest conversations about CES from a number of directions, but we have to work with our partners and in conversation with the COC. But it is definitely high on my list.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Senator Rogers?
Thank you, Chairman. A couple points. I want to get back on the Echo Village in a minute, but we understand, I thought, and many of my constituents thought, that was kind of an anomaly on how much that operation costs to get up and going for the Echo Village. But apparently it's not. We mentioned the money costing almost $400,000 a unit in other projects that break down to that. And it was mentioned that there were a lot of stipulations. There's only a limited amount of money going around. And when you hear $400,000 in a unit, you're thinking, if we can do 100, how much more can we do if we address why that is costing us $400,000 per unit? Housing costs are high, but you would think that it would be nowhere near 400,000. So I was wondering if somebody could provide this committee with an example or documentation on how that's broken down, where a unit can come up to being $400,000, because I thought the Eco Village was an anomaly, but apparently it's not. And with the limited amount of money that's going around, if we can address and somehow bring that $400,000 down and make these units a little less costly, we can put up more units, which will help us to the goal of doing that. But I don't know if that's something you guys can provide this body. And my other point was back to the Eco Village. Maybe, I don't want to play armchair quarterback, but what is the square footage size of those units? Around 80, something, I would assume.
The sleeping units are 70 square feet. The office units are 120 square feet. The community room is 400 square feet, and the amenity buildings are about 120.
So the majority of the units are the one-person sleeping units at a little over 70 square feet.
Correct. 45 of those structures of the 45 of the 54 are sleeping units.
So to put that in for people that don't know the square footage, a 10 by 8 foot area, I mean, it's smaller than a shed. That's 80 square feet, a 10 foot by 8 foot shed that you don't even need a permit in most towns to put on your property. This being said, it amazes me how long it took for this to get going. We heard it all in the media on, the delays, and a lot of it fell down on, everybody keeps saying, or I'm hearing, that it didn't fit in any zoning category. Was it ever thought of to actually, because this is new, it's nothing, you've said it here, it's nothing new, it's some type of new thing that we're coming up with. It's like if cars stop flying, we're gonna have to immediately do new regulations because it would be new. Was it ever thought of creating its special zoning and regulation for these? Is there a new type? I mean, it seemed to me you got dragged down a lot trying to figure out where it went, and then where it went, it wound up being in hotel, motel. Hotel is a multi-story, motel is single story where you pull up to it. I don't know of any motel room in the entire state that is 70 square feet. So I think maybe this is thinking after, but was there any ever thought of creating new zoning and regulations for this new type of housing, which would have sped this up instead of trying to throw it in multiple categories, which caused the delay? And in construction, when it's first delayed, it continues to delay the other products. So if you have a problem with insulation and the insulation takes 2 weeks to get there, you can't put the sheetrock up until the wiring and the insulation's done. So one problem leads to the next. Mm-hmm. Was that ever thought of a possibility of coming up with a new zoning?
I can't speak to the past. I don't honestly know. What I can speak to is that we have started conversations with Director Dwyer and her staff about how to get more yeses, and where can we find ways in, not the zoning code, that's local, but in the fire and building code to have gotten to yes. So we're starting those conversations with them. And then where can we find those points that we think we can have success in amending the codes?
And I think I got up this morning when I started my truck out. It was -1 degree. Do we understand the delays and what the ramifications are on the weather that we're dealing with? I don't know. My heart goes out to a lot of people that are having to live outside in that type of weather. I don't know how they do it.
The word urgency was used before. Also, just yes, it's inhumane, and we need to have a collective mind and a collective will across government, across communities, across actors to address this and not. And I can only say that I want to keep looking forward. I don't want to forget what happened in the past. I want to try to solve for what happened in the past. And if allowed, that will be my pledge.
Thank you. Senator Coleman.
Laura, could you
May
just
I
identify
respectfully-
yourself for the record? Just, we're going to...
Absolutely. Laura Jaworski, I'm the Executive Director for House of Hope CDC. We have received the competitive award from the Department of Housing to be involved on the construction phase and then to be the operator of Eco Village once it opens. I just want to hit on a couple of points. It is really frustrating to be able to Monday morning quarterback, for sure, because you have the benefit of being able to look back and saying, oh, if only, coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? And I think to your point with suggesting alternative codes or even legislation, I personally did vast amount of research, and we're tracking and following what communities in the United States and North America, United States and Canada, we're doing all across North America to roll out rapidly deployable units. From what I could tell from those specific communities, and particularly it was beneficial when communities like Boston and Burlington, Vermont, areas that are also situated similarly weather-wise to us and somewhat in terms of code and zoning, we were able to look and see how their process was. So Boston also issued a brief that said the playbook for how Boston did this in 100 days or less. In looking through those examples, I didn't see a lot of communities that were changing their code or introducing legislation just at surface. Again, just as I was following and tracking. I'll also share, and this is in my presentation, we were also in a pandemic mindset for 4 years. And so what that makes a big difference when it comes to our ability to rapidly pivot and respond. Think back to how we were quickly setting up field hospitals and vaccination sites and testing clinics, and we were moving very quickly. So based on what I was scanning, I at least personally didn't think that was a pathway we needed to go down. And at the same time, wanting to respect the authorities and the expertise that the building commissioner, the fire marshals, and others hold to guide us in that process in our attempts to present this project either before this most recent effort or in the 4 years that I have been involved in trying to, push this project forward as a necessity for folks who are unsheltered in Rhode Island. So at the time, didn't feel there was a pathway for that. I will say that we've asked, and we're going to be participating in a debrief once the construction phase is over and we get that behind us, so that we can then forward suggestions and ideas. I'm offering a couple in my presentation, but we want to get to that. If the legacy of Echo Village is that it improves the ability to make solutions happen for people, then I want to be a part of that. It's unfortunate that it has gotten us to this place. I oversee the state's largest street-based homeless outreach provider. That includes people who are out there walking the streets early morning at the time when you're starting your car and late at night, and trying to get people into safe spaces that are either for them to warm up or even to cool down, conversely. And the damage that being able to outreach with empty hands has done, the fact that I have a street outreach team is remarkable, because they are the ones that are doing that work day in and day out. They are the ones that are being accused of being incentivized to keep people homeless when they're handing out tents when it comes time to help folks survive. That has become our reality as well at House of Hope and at other homeless service providers here in our state. The numbers and the needs have grown far too great for us to be able to feel like we're making any sort of dent. And we're faced with folks every single day when it comes down to shelter or survival. And that's our reality. So we share that. And that is also why we have done what we've done these last 4 years in pushing for Echo Village, because my staff, myself, and my board believe that we owe people this dignity to be able to be sheltered properly and safely in our state.
Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Acting Secretary, for being here today. I agree with the sentiment of forward-lookingness, and I think obviously one of the biggest ways that we're going to solve the problem is by bringing more housing online. So to that end, I'm curious about your perspectives. The General Assembly has put a bunch of money into housing over the last couple of years. In that was $10 million dedicated to a public development project, and I'd like to hear your take on that. Obviously, this is a thing that we've been exploring and that other parts of the country have been exploring with great success: public development and public management, public ownership of projects like this.
Sure. I start with let's all identify the various forms of public development, public ownership we're talking about, because there are a variety of models. So let's be clear as we talk about each of them, what we see the pros and cons being. I think that the idea of public ownership, I'm a huge fan of public housing authorities. I spent 2 stints in Boston and in New York City in public housing authorities. I think they've been undervalued. But we do have an infrastructure of public owners and public developers that I think should not be bypassed quickly in this discussion. We may want something else, I'm not sure. We've also created the proactive housing corporation at Rhode Island Housing, so should we take a look at that? I met recently with Dan Denver, and those conversations are going to continue. We're also going to put out a request for, I'm calling it RFI, I don't mean that in the strict procurement way, but a survey. Let's get ideas. What do people think this is? Which of the models provide benefits? Equity stake? Does it have to be ownership? Do we, how much risk do we want to take on? So I think we need to look at all of that. And as I said, also let's not forget the public developers that we have, and maybe we want to utilize them.
Senator, may I ask a follow-up to your question, Senator Coleman? Can I say, so that $10 million public developer investment, which I was happy to sponsor, was part of a $120 million housing bond. And at the risk of getting to something which may be interesting, could you maybe talk a little bit with members of the committee about how you anticipate the governance of that bond, or maybe what is left to be determined, because you are the acting Secretary of Housing, and some may expect the Department of Housing to manage that bond?
I have not had final discussions with the governor on that. I certainly expect the department to be in a position of authority on how the money will be spent. What do we spend it? Does it come through us? Does it come through our partners? Not at all sure. The one thing I've heard today, which I've heard in other places, of course, that I do want to think about in terms of deploying the bond bill is simplicity. Or, yes, we don't need, I come from Massachusetts, 10 funding sources in a project is fairly normal, unfortunately. I've never heard of what you just mentioned. So there are things to be worked out, and I want to have a strong voice in those conversations.
I would just say any situation where we can avoid 3 panels would be a good one.
Agreed.
We have Senator Gu, Senator Mack, Senator Acosta, and then Senator Zurier and Senator De La Cruz. I would caution the committee that we also have a session that begins in about 40 minutes. And so to the extent we can, if there could be questions at this time for Acting Secretary Goddard, and you could confine it to questions for her, that would be appreciated.
Thank you, Secretary, and the others for presenting. So 2 questions. First is I had a conversation with Westerly Warm Center, and I've heard this is common with other organizations too, the backlog of payments, sometimes several months backlog, which is on the order of $300,000. So what is your plan to just make sure this basic function is getting done on a timely manner? More than a year ago, it used to be that it would only take 6 weeks or so to get those payments through. And then the second question is just on slide 10, it said, strategy for CHF 25, maximize existing emergency shelter capacity with a focus on year-round rather than seasonal beds. And in South County, at least, we have a lot of people who sleep out in Burlingame Park in the summer, and may have more demands, and our warm shelter scales up and pays for motel beds in the winter. So it seems like there's more of a scaling up in the winter. So my question is more, is the demand for summer, spring, and fall housing truly the same as the winter housing? And given the fact that a lot of the folks here on the committee are very concerned about people being outside in the sub-zero temperatures.
So I'll take the second question first.
Yeah.
I believe that winter is still more dangerous than summer, although unfortunately we're getting close to being equal. But the point is, we did open expanded capacity last winter, and that never went away. So that expanded capacity is built in to the 12-month stock now, and that's why you didn't see here in the spring and here in the winter, because they were open the whole time, and that was based on advice and suggestions from the provider community. In terms of the payments, some people were out 60 days. The contract started in October, so the most they were out was 60 days, and I'm not saying that's okay. And some operate in a shoestring, and we offered to triage and prioritize for folks that really were suffering and did that. Again, I think 2 things. One, I'm staffing up. That's extremely critical in both the homeless and the finance units. Secondly, we're going to have a cycle of putting out our RFP in a timely manner such that we're on a planned, what's the word I'm looking for? Appropriate, timely schedule, so that we're not rushing at the end to get contracts in place after one has expired, and we're chasing our paper at that point. That's my commitment that won't happen again.
Senator Mack.
Thank you, and I have several questions, sorry. But thank you, Acting Secretary. I look forward to your advice and consent, hearing to learn more about your background and commitment to housing. Your success is the success of every Rhode Islander, including our most vulnerable. Another question I have, in addition to funding taking a really long time, up to 90 days for many providers who don't have the reserves on hand to be able to afford invoicing, there's also been a concern from many of my constituents. I represent most of the largest service providers for homelessness in my district, including Crossroads, Better Lives Rhode Island. Sojourner has one of their shelters, House of Kodak, also with some of the most marginalized folks, including the LGBTQ plus community. One of the concerns that has come to me from several of these organizations is that contracts have been taking months. Many have been operating either without contracts, or they have contracts that have not been executed dating back to October. And this is not a this year problem. There was also a letter circulated last January expressing that there were outstanding contracts and upwards of $4 million in funds not dispersed to service providers. What are some of the lags in process that prevent expediency with the disbursement of funds and with contracts? And how can you, or how in your experience have you seen contracts being able to be executed in a timely fashion so that we can get some of our smaller service providers the ability to be operational and also the funding to be operational?
I think in large part it still goes back to having a sane calendar, a same calendar for getting the RFP out, responses due, award letters, contracts. A little bit into the weeds, the department did not have great contract templates. I've heard this from my staff, so that they were working, as they're trying to award contracts, they're working to create the contract template. Again, and I think the department may have made some things more complicated than it needs to. So if a provider gets 3 awards and is running 3 different programs, that might be 3 contracts. I just don't think that's necessary. There's a way to do a single contract with parts. But again, I don't want to blame or criticize or rehash the past. That I don't have all the facts. I can only say that it doesn't have to be that way. It should not be that way, and it's not rocket science to fix those problems.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier that the department is maintaining the same level of beds. I think there was only one additional one added this year. But we also know that there was over 33% increase in homelessness from last year to this year. How do you explain keeping the level of shelter beds the same when we know that the need has increased? And is there a plan, or is there a process for determining year over year how we can increase the number of shelter beds and not warming shelters? Because there's a very big distinction between warming shelters, which are only designed to keep people warm. Oftentimes, because I've been inside of many of them, folks are in a well-lit room during the day, oftentimes sitting upright like we are now, and not being provided a place to lay their head down during some of the most brutal cold days and also heat days. So what is the process for the department to determine year over year, as we see Rhode Island is on the list of states that have increased in need year over year due to the pandemic, to increase shelter beds and increase providers, increase contracts, and increase funding to ensure that when we have cold months and hot months and year round, we have a number of beds to provide for those who are unsheltered?
There's not an easy answer to that question. Certainly, the governor has been clear to us that folks need to be sheltered, not sitting, as our first tier response to what's going on. we are facing fiscal constraints. My focus, I do think that as a system, we can do a better job of diversion, of catching people before they fall into the system. And if they fall into the system, do the work that is being done to connect them with supports and services that will get them back up. I've said this before, but if someone's car breaks down and they can't get to work, they could fall into homelessness, they can't pay their rent. We can fix that pretty easily. You know, if someone has a medical bill that's going to break them, we can fix that pretty easily. So I think we have to be extremely strategic and knowledgeable about where are these folks, where are they touching our system, where did we let them down before they became homeless? Can we shut that inflow? So that's really what I think we have to focus on.
Yes.
Sorry, one last follow-up question. Thank you for mentioning some of the realities of homelessness. And if anyone has not yet read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, who now runs the eviction lab through Princeton, which is a great database to understand some of these issues. You mentioned a couple of policies, and the last secretary I was able to work with to identify some legislation that would also prevent some of the rates of homelessness, including more likely to be families, more likely to be young children, and more likely to be people who are currently receiving an income. Has your department, or have you thought in your time of supporting things like just cause eviction, which will help stabilize rents so that folks cannot expect to pay more than 4 or 10% of their income, or expect to pay more than 10% increase in rents. Eviction defense, currently through COVID funding, there is eviction defense funding so that folks who are more likely to receive court support are more likely to avert evictions, and also more likely to be more stably housed, and less likely to have an eviction prevent them from stable housing. And also a commitment to other legislation like Code Red and Code Blue, which will have a statewide plan for events of cold weather or hot weather, so that we next winter and next summer we don't have a situation where we're guessing at what is the protocol for having municipal warming shelters or municipal cooling shelters, so that there is responsive legislation, not just thinking about what the homeless infrastructure is, but also how do we truly prevent homelessness through eviction diversion, through stabilizing rents, and ensuring that we have things like the public developer model, which actually puts more money back into the homelessness and housing system.
I haven't had those conversations here. Obviously, Code Red and Code Blue I had not heard of at all. The eviction, just cause eviction, and the other landlord-tenant matters are not new to me, because they are conversations that are held within the housing arena everywhere. I have not participated in the debate here. I am open to it. I think we need to be open to everything, open to discussion. I'm not willing at this point to stake out an opinion on it here.
Thank you.
Senator Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director, for your presentation. I want to follow up with slightly more pointed questions than my very articulate colleagues, Senator Rogers and Senator Coleman. So on the question of Echo Village, I hear you on not wanting to look back. So looking forward, can you tell us, based on what you know right now, the latest date that we can expect this to be open? I need to know the date that it will be, so don't be optimistic. But from your most pessimistic read, I got a list. For those of us lower on the totem pole, we don't go to the fancy hotel, we go somewhere around the Jake. So if I'm driving to the Jake, potentially for Chairman Jake's, what's the latest that I can expect Echo Village to be open? And as far as the public developer question, or really the public development question, you don't have to answer me now, but at least when we meet in the Finance Committee, I'd like to know, with this $10 million that we're talking about, speaking for myself, I think for a few handful of my colleagues, we think about public development in the same way that people talk about in Montgomery County. So you're very excited about public housing authorities. Yes, they have a thriving one, but as a complement to that, they have a public development arm that builds housing. So if we gave you $10 million, and if my experience in this space says anything, you're going to use $1 million of that for administration, that's fine. If you have $9 million to carry out public development in our state, how many units will you build, and at what cost?
Echo Village, latest it would be open end of February. I'm quite confident we'll beat that.
What was that? Sorry?
End of February. In terms of what $9 or $10 million can build, I can't give you a number. So I've read the RIPEC report. The cost of housing has been something that the affordable housing community has been faced with as long as I've been in the business. It depends upon the number of bedrooms. Are we building family housing or elderly housing? Big question. How dense are we building? Will our communities allow for denser development, which lowers the per unit cost? The RIPEC report says that there are supplemental aspects to the housing we're building in affordable housing. And by that, they mean the community center or the landscaping, or maybe some of the green, the sustainable elements of the housing. I'm not sure we want to give up on any of that. I think we're building community as well as housing. I welcome the debate. I'm already scheduled to go out and look at some housing that market folks say they're bringing in at something less than 400,000. But I can tell you they're not 2 and 3 bedroom units. They're not family housing. They don't have the green elements. So we just need to be open to that conversation. So public development could save on land cost. That would be big, right? I think we should really look at what the state owns and what of it is appropriate for housing. So taking the land cost out could be helpful. That's not a function of a public developer, but could be something they work on. Montgomery County has a very different housing economic context than we have, where the market rate do underwrite to some extent the lower income. They do not serve extremely low income in those units. By their own admission, they can't afford to. So again, open to conversation. What are we getting for it? I do like the idea Montgomery County gets an equity stake. You know, they put money in, they get something back for it. So open to all those conversations, but I can't pretend in any reasonable manner to tell you how many units I'm going to get with $9 or $10 million.
Senator Acosta.
Yeah, and just so one quick follow-up. One of the things that came up is the way that various developers, both nonprofit and private developers, have to braid various sources of funding together. In your experience, have you worked with direct single sources of funding? And in a public developer model, would you expect that the Department of Housing or the state, via some form of bond, could provide single source funding for a project?
I think we can simplify it for sure. If you're going to use tax credits, for instance, you're going to braid it because tax credits are only going to cover a portion. I think on your smaller developments, one thing I do want to look at is if we're doing smaller developments or supportive housing that really can't take on the weight of debt or tax credit, can we just simply put that out maybe with a single source of funds? But we can definitely reduce the layering of the funding.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary Gard. I was certainly pleased to learn of the resumption of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. From time to time, my constituents say, what's the deal with this and when is it going to meet? And I have letters to your predecessors, and this is great. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about the role that municipalities play in solving the problems of homelessness. I noticed on your chart, it talks about coordinating services for a bunch of state agencies, but it doesn't talk about coordinating with municipalities. I noticed in the minutes of the first meeting, there was a municipal homelessness support initiative, which appeared to be grants as opposed to technical support. And I'll give you an issue through which this could be discussed, and that is homelessness encampments. I went to a community meeting last week where a police officer said he felt he was on the front lines. He was getting complaints from neighbors about an encampment. He had compassion for the residents. They were giving heaters to the people living there, giving them food. But at various times, there were public health concerns, there were public safety concerns. He would ask them to move. They would say, yes, we understand, we'll move. And they found another place. And it's kind of like he viewed it as a carousel. So that's just one example. And the question is, what can the state do to help municipalities with best practices and how they can help address the issue of homelessness?
I'm thinking for a second because I haven't been asked this, or we haven't provided technical assistance. We've provided some assistance to help them do their warming centers or take care of transportation costs, whatever they've put in front of us in terms of assistance that they need. Obviously this is an issue that's been debated across the country, in some places with more generosity than other places. So I don't have a quick answer for you, but I empathize with what the officer's saying, and I am grateful that he has that humane perspective towards the folks that are living in that encampment. I think it's a conversation we all need to be at the table about. I think, frankly, we have to be at the table with the municipalities on all of these housing and homeless issues, and I hope that we can work to get them to the table. Some have been very good partners. We need all of them at the table.
Do you see the Interagency Council on Homelessness as an appropriate vehicle for working on the relationship with municipalities?
Well, one connection we would have, obviously, is that Raima is on the council, and they have the direct contact with fire chiefs, police chiefs. So there's definitely an angle for conversation there. Yes.
Thank you. Senator De La Cruz.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a bunch of notes, and I know I'm not going to be able to get answers to them because we are limited on time. And so bear with me as I just go through some of these notes that are a bit scrambled here on my paper. You know, there's been some talk about not looking at the past, or that was the past, we want to look to the future, and I get that, we want to be forward-looking, but we do need to look at the past. We need to understand, there's that old adage, right? If we don't learn from history, then history is going to repeat itself, right? And so we do need to look at the past and see what went wrong, how can we improve so that we don't encounter this massive failure once more. We need to know why the administration was not prepared, not to scold, you know, the governor or yourselves. You know, this, Madam Secretary, you're new to the job. You are acting secretary, Mr. Connor. This probably predates both of you. Again, not to scold, but we need to know what happened, where was the failure, so we don't do this again. Because although you say we'll have likely those pallet shelters open in late February, February is the coldest month. And by the time the end of February comes, we're looking at spring. It will still be cold, and we might even have some snow days, but you said it yourself, this is unethical. We have housing right now, empty, available for individuals that cannot use them. I wonder if it's safer to have individuals in pallet shelters instead of trying to, you know, start a fire outside of their tent. I think it's safer to have individuals in pallet shelters that don't have fire suppression ready, but it's still safer than having a fire outside their tent that could essentially go up in flames. It's almost like, you know, stories, I think, kind of comparisons kind of help us, but it's like you're out on a boat, you see people drowning, you have space in the boat where you're like, oh, I wish somebody could help them. Like, that's what's happening. We see homeless individuals here in Rhode Island who could benefit from the pallet shelters, but can't, because government is seemingly inept, unfortunately. And yet we're talking about February. So how can we learn what regulations do we have in place that are preventing individuals from getting into those pallet shelters? Also, has the administration tried to reach out to the city of Providence to try to expedite the permitting process? I mean, he's the governor, so I'm sure he must know the building inspector, right? Mr. Building Inspector, can we have you come look at our building immediately? You know, we're facing a crisis here. But again, I'm not going to get those answers to those questions today. But the governor was on Gene Valicenti just recently, and he mentioned approximately 66% capacity. I'm sorry, there's 33% left. They're not at capacity. There's room for about 33. I think he said they were 66% capacity, if I'm correct. Why isn't that other 33 being utilized? I'm assuming some of it's for families, some of it's for individuals, drug addiction.
The day-to-day utilization?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that one.
There are a variety of reasons. Some attend to, again, opening up the question of CES. So if you go through CES, your bed can be reserved for up to 48 hours. Question whether that we need to stick with that policy, but again, want to work with our partners. They could have good reason for that I don't understand, being new coming into the system. Yes, some are families, and that's one thing we struggled with. Family shelters are counted by unit, should be counted by unit, multiple beds inside a unit. So if you have a 3-person family and they're in a 4-bed unit, there is a bed available, but that unit's not available. So we've got to adjust how we represent and how the coalition and the policies of the continuum of care present that data. You could be in a shelter one night, leave the next day, not come back, and still have the right to come back the following night. So all sorts of permutations. And then there are shelters that provide specialized services, and there may not be a match. And if I may, I do want to say, it's not that I don't want to learn from the past. I don't want to rehash the past, and I don't want to blame others that came before me. But I absolutely agree with you. We need to understand what went wrong to cure it going forward.
Just one last thing, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry. I don't want to take up too much time, but when I build a house, I've never built one, but in addition, a renovation, I have to do my due diligence. One time I started a renovation, I thought, oh my goodness, what if I, get in trouble with the town? So I went to the town, figured out, some things that I could do as a homeowner that I didn't need a permit. And if I have to do that as a regular citizen, why didn't someone in the government say, hey, we're building something, we need to probably know the regulations before we just start erecting structures and then, be stopped halfway through this important project. And I do want to echo something that Senator Rogers said, and even Senator Acosta, is that $400,000 a unit is not affordable, and not even for the state. And for a 1-bedroom, that's like a luxury apartment. So I'm not sure, there has to be some sort of breakdown somewhere where maybe someone messed up on the math or something. But we need to be able to build more housing with $400,000 than a 1-bedroom apartment.
Yeah, just to correct, I think the 400,000 is not a 1-bedroom. I mean, yes, it is a 1-bedroom, 2s and 3s or more. And we will get the answer to, we may not get an answer that pleases everyone, but we do need to dig into this. Absolutely. I met with RIPEC already. I'll be meeting with them later this week. I met with the staff last week. I meet with the trustees later this week. I want to dig into that data. I want to understand it, but I'm also not willing to say that we want to put the least expensive unit out. And that's not the way to win the hearts and minds of folks in neighborhoods, and it is a way to demean the people that we're putting into that housing. That's what we did to public housing, and then we blamed them for what we did with the investment. I do want to correct one thing, Senator, on the inspections. They are at the state level, so they're through DBR. They're being coordinated, so they're not sequential, but they're collapsed.
If I could exercise my own prerogative and just ask a question before Senator Murray, and then we want to make sure we get to Laura Jaworski as well. Following up on what Senator De La Cruz and Senator Zuriya said with respect to municipal and I guess the question that I've heard more than anything else from people out there is why wasn't this fast-tracked? And I'm curious. As a baseball fan, I fully remember the Paw Sox and the efforts this Senate made to keep the Paw Sox. And I also heard from a lot of people around that time, why didn't the governor get everyone in one room to make sure that the Paw Sox stayed here? I asked the same question, and perhaps Senator Connors, you might know the answer to this, but I'm curious. Was there ever a time where the governor or the housing secretary or someone said, we're going to get everyone in the room, whether it's municipal or state, whoever needs to do the inspections and whoever is doing the various aspects of this project? Was there ever a time where that was done to say, we're going to get this done and we're going to get it done in 2 weeks?
So, what I can, I think, and maybe I can provide a little more context to some of the questions around the contracting and whatnot. But I think it's fair to say that the governor has approached this with a level of urgency in my time when I was serving as the housing secretary. There were a number of meetings, that were within the administration, but many of Rhode Island in the wake of the station fire adopted a pretty rigorous fire code, and not all of that decision making is within the governor's control. There are independent people that have to make decisions. There are boards that have to make decisions, and I don't think the governor ever indicated that he wanted to walk back what professionals have determined to be necessary to keep people safe. So I think that's there are always lessons that can be learned, and I think that I was chuckling when the minority leader mentioned about the lessons of the past. When I was up here, I used to like to say, to be ignorant what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. What is the worth of human life unless it's woven into the lives of our ancestors through the records of history? That was Senator Cicero. So I think we have to be mindful of what transpired before. So there's a reason why Rhode Island is an outlier in the fire safety code. And second to that, I think we also have to recognize that before the pandemic, Rhode Island wasn't doing much in the way of providing temporary emergency shelter for people experiencing homelessness. I mean, Crossroads has been doing the Lord's work for a long time, but the state itself, these decisions were made on the fly during a public health emergency, and the evolution of it has really come to land within the Department of Housing. And I think that Secretary Pryor deserves credit for bringing it into a contracting mode. And then I think, while I was there, the team, the hardworking, 50% staffed people at the Department of Housing worked hard to bring performance management measures into the contracts, and they tried to work collaboratively with providers to offer them extensions of existing contracts or new contracts. And it was bumpy. When the department was set up, there were a lot of functions that needed to be built out. And that started under Secretary Pryor. I was able to make, some strides to augment the finance staff and the legal staff. I think that Secretary Goddard has taken that a step further, with active postings for key positions in the homelessness response lane and in the finance lane. And when she tells you that, she doesn't want to rehash the past, but looking forward, I think what I see being a little bit removed now is like a clear set of action steps to put the necessary, players on the field, so to speak, to ensure that when invoices come in, they're processed and they're sent, to DOA for prompt payment. And, I think the fact of the matter is that when you make decisions in the next budget cycle about what's going to be sustainable for homelessness response, you're going to reimagine your delivery system. And the successor system, what will ultimately come to be, I think the answer to your question, Chairman McKenney, is yes. The governor, instructed the department to open up lines of communication with the Department of Business Regulation, and Secretary Goddard alluded to that. There are conversations to ensure that whatever's done in the future will be optimized with a lens toward compliance, to bend the timeline to, a ribbon cutting. And, that's the best I can say. It's probably the last area of state government that hasn't really unwound from the public health emergency. Like DOH ended the emergency, Medicaid, DHS re-enrolled everyone, returned to normal operations. But this is still a lingering area where the state needs to make decisions about, what system is sustainable for the future.
Thank you. Senator Murray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one last point that I want to bring forward, because we know that being unhoused affects healthcare and especially behavioral health, and that, as you say, we don't want people to fall through the cracks. We need to basically create a plan to work across these systems that doesn't happen. But I am wondering if you are aware that hospitals and nursing homes are discharging folks without adequately making sure that they have safe shelter. And if you are aware, is there a plan, or how do we create a plan to ensure that this doesn't happen going forward?
Sorry, I am aware, and it came up at the January interagency meeting. And I don't want to sound rote, but it is these conversations that we have to have. It's a whole of government solution. You can't look at housing and say, not mine anymore. We have to work together.
Thank you for that. And I also want to say, going forward, when the issues like this come up, please come to the legislature. If there are things that you need us to do so that we can provide and make sure that these folks, don't end up on the street, please, we're more than willing to help you.
Thank you. As I said, I do value partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have more time, a bit more time. I think about 10 minutes. And so, Ms. Jaworski, if I can ask you, and I know it's difficult, but a lot of questions had to be asked. If you could please proceed.
Thank you all very much. As Laura Jaworski, Executive Director, House of Hope CDC, I speak real fast, and so keep up. Hope you've got sneakers on under those desks. But we'll get you through it. And a lot of this I'll skip through. As you all know, I was afforded the opportunity to make a presentation to the Housing Affordability Committee last month on the other side, and so a lot of this is rinse and repeat. But there's just a couple of points that I wanted to add on. And first, before I even dive in, you're getting roasted for the not wanting to look back. And in fact, I can appreciate that. But history does in fact repeat itself. And I'll just take this moment to invoke just the memory of so many of the advocates like John Joyce and others that were with us when we came into this room, when your former colleague, Senator Tassoni, brought us all in here and had a lot of the same line of questioning then as you are now. So shame on us, but also I applaud you all for taking this, but also to remember folks like John, more recently Diamond, and others for whom we've lost most recently, and for whom is the driving force behind House of Hope's not only our mission, but every single day and what gets us out of our beds and to do this hard, most difficult work each and every day on behalf of the most vulnerable Rhode Islanders. So I just want to invoke that as we're having this kind of discussion. A few points that I, again, will quickly make. The first sentence of our mission statement at House of Hope is that we believe that housing is a basic human right, so much so that we put it in our mission. Every single thing that we do rolls up to that. It doesn't always look like that, but it gets us to that, and that's our guidepost every single day. So whether we're doing street-based outreach, transitional shelter, shower to empower, or even supporting over 200 folks in housing, either of our own or through partner landlords, everything is in service of that mission. And so, of course, it would be no different that when the pandemic hit, we were really cognizant of what folks were facing on the streets. We serve about 1,000 folks who are facing unsheltered homelessness or housing insecurity or underemployment or unemployment each and every year. Most of those who end up chronic homeless, as we've talked about already. And in those early days, we heard the needs growing even more so. So we were always wondering how we could answer this question about really meeting the safety of unsheltered Rhode Islanders. And we really were watching, too, what was happening across the country and the evolution of rolling out rapidly deployable units. Again, not a concept that is housing, but is temporary and on purpose. They're not meant to be anyone's forever homes. They are meant to be a temporary solution: walls, a bed, heating, cooling, fire, and a door that locks. That's all it is, and it's meant purposely built that way so that people are reminded that this is not somewhere that someone should stay forever should policy or funding priorities shift, but it's meant to say we need to get on to the next. So again, context matters. There's a whole bunch of history here. It's also really colorful. Enjoy it later at your leisure. I've already touched upon this. One point I will pull out is that I know it's been really frustrating. You all have visibly seen those pallet structures having been constructed a year ago, almost to the day. I get that. However, work was not allowed to occur on that site. Sequential to that, permits to do that construction work were not issued fully, and variances had not been identified, and all of that work had not been done. This project has been in the forefront because this issue has been in the forefront. Permits were not issued on this project until June. So just for context, to just readjust our timeline, it's 7 months that this project has been actively under construction. That's still an incredibly aggressive and remarkable time period to have done what we've done on that site, and I just want to applaud very specifically Lauren Barnes from the Department of Housing. This young woman has cut her teeth on this project and is a tremendous asset, not only to the department, but to the state of Rhode Island. Gill Engineering and the hard work that they have done in moving through all of these pieces of trying to shift codes and what have you. And Atlantic Control Systems, which is our general contractor, and the way that they have also been able to lead this project and the subs underneath it. It's a remarkable team that has been in lockstep with myself at House of Hope to move this project forward. Our role, sharing information, guidance, advising as a service provider, and then of course we are involved as the shelter provider, as the operator once we are complete. There was a question about the budget for Echo Village. We are working through some final components, but what was put forward was a response to the RFP that totaled $3.3 million. That number has been the subject of a lot of lazy math. And I'll sit here to say that it was being done as the number of structures divided by $3.3 million. The problem with that math is the fact that there's two things that happen in that total. The 3.3 million are to address that construction phase, right? Capital needs, and then there's the operations when we first put forward. So it's a bit of a misnomer to be thinking about and doing the math that way. This project, once we're up and running, will cost about $1 million to operate, which is on par with other large homeless shelters that we ourselves have even operated at House of Hope at one time in the past. I was asked to also come with a couple of ideas for areas to look more deeply into. I will remind us all, as I said before, we were in a pandemic mindset for a lot of years, and a lot of other communities were too. That's when they initiated states of emergency, public health crises, and other things, right? Because we were, again, trying to move and pivot very quickly to meet everybody's needs, no matter if you were housed or unhoused. We all were trying to pivot very quickly. There's a lot of good lessons that we can even learn from that, and the fact that when we put our minds to something and we get all the other stuff out of the way, we can actually accomplish something. So that's a great lesson to be mindful of and to remember. The second part, we also didn't have a Department of Housing that was either stood up or it was brand new, or those positions were being elevated. So we also have to remember that. We didn't have any consolidated or centralized place of leadership, or at least one that has been established. So really allowing the Department of Housing to get itself up, running, and established is a very important factor. It's difficult to do that when we have our fourth acting secretary. So we need to also allow that department the opportunity to get itself going, okay? Still staying on them and being watchful, but again, it's brand new in a very, very complicated sea. The last piece, the Interagency Council, dormant, legislatively mandated body that sat for 7-8 years and hadn't been convened. This is a great opportunity for the governor to call those department heads to come around and start problem solving specifically around this issue. Because far too often, those other department agencies, when it hits the fan, and I say this respectfully, they all end up in our system. And I'm not trying to stake claim or ownership or speak disrespectfully to departments or people in need, but we've seen it firsthand. When people come out of correctional facilities, they struggle. Where do they end up? Homelessness. When families are struggling in the child welfare system, oftentimes, where do they end up? In the homeless system. And we see this play out time and time again, but we are not given the means to support that work, and neither are those other departments. And beyond that, we're never even afforded the opportunity to do a lot of that cross-departmental collaboration that is really essential to be able to serve the people that all of our departments are really all sharing, and a lot of the times the same way. So the Interagency Council is a really important policy measure to lean on and lean into, and perhaps even give some emergency considerations for in either its cadence of meetings or what it has powers to do. And then lastly, I'll say there is legislation that this body can look at, and I'm sure there's others across the country. California is often the window to the rest of the United States and is years ahead of us. However, California does have something called a Shelter Crisis Law or Crisis Act. And this is, again, the details are in the PowerPoint, but this is a shelter act that can be enacted by a governing body, typically a governor or someone else. And it does some very narrow provides some very narrow actions, and it's a very narrow declaration. So it's not like opening up Pandora's box to everything being able to come through and completely obliterating either fire safety or building code requirements, but it gives some very specific guidance about how we can handle emergency housing that can be built. It talks about what those definitions are of those emergency crises. So it really gives some very helpful insight as to what we might be able to look at here that might be more palatable in terms of being laser focused on addressing the issues simply of unsheltered homelessness. And as I said before, bits and pieces, and as Acting Secretary Goddard touched upon, we are in the final phases of construction. We're in a matter of weeks, if not days. The electrification of the site, these are not able to be moved into at all. And I know that there's been rhetoric around about these are already ready for people to move into. They are not. We didn't have the beds in until last week. And we only had power, permanent power, with lines given to the site just this past week. So we are in the active phase. I was just there on Friday. I was just there with one of your colleagues on the House side before. We have to have the power into the site. It's more than just a switch. It's about, yes, that has to happen, but Rhode Island Energy coming out and running poles and running wires. And then we have to go through into all of those 54 structures and test the heating element that we put in, the firebox element that we put in, the fire alarm, all of those testing mechanisms. We have to go through that. The general contractors coordinating with all of the experts that have been named before to make sure that we are consolidating or sequencing any of the inspections that need to happen. So that is not a holdup bureaucracy-wise. Operations for the site's prep is actively underway. We are preparing for that. I have hired all of the staff for Echo Village. They all started just after the new year. They have been doing orientation and training. They're working on the first batch of move-ins to prepare that case conferencing, and we're in that home stretch.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the brevity there. We have about 2 minutes left. I can talk fast if you can talk fast. I can ask fast if you can answer fast. Suffice to say, too little, too late on the part of public officials to lend their support to this project.
I'm sorry, the what?
We're well on our way to getting open. Suffice to say,
Correct.
Too little, too late. Thank you for the public pressure, correct?
Accurate.
All right. Okay, when did you
For this specific project.
Right, exactly what I want to get into. When did you first endeavor to open Echo Village? How many years ago?
August of 2020, House of Hope's board officially decided to pursue
How many
this moving
sites did you look at before the current site?
I believe this is site 7 or 8.
As Senator Rogers had alluded to, with some sort of idea of maybe a master permitting process or some sort of side permitting process for developments like this have helped?
Yes.
absolutely. Is it fair to say that that master permitting process and maybe some increased support among policymakers and stakeholders as we go forward and try to open up more communities would be helpful?
Not support, but willingness to be brave.
Thank you very much. Any other questions regarding ECHO from members of either committee? Best of luck. I hope you open very soon. If there's any, I mean, suffice to say, there's nothing this committee could do to help you at this time?
I would just ask that we remind ourselves of the humanity and the importance of here. It's been really heartwarming to hear that that has not been lost here in the dialogue and the questioning that this group has presented. And I'd ask all of Rhode Island to stay on track with that. We can't lose sight of who we're helping here, and that's people, in any way that we possibly can. And so ECHO is a very visible manifestation of that, but also it comes down to one-on-one. And so I'd ask that group to do that.
Ms. Jaworski, thank you for your time. Ms. Wilcox, thank you for your time. Secretary Goddard, we're here 1 year from now. We do our point-in-time survey tonight. There's yet another double-digit increase in homelessness. Who's responsible for discharging and the rapid response of the state? Where's the COC? Rhode Island Housing or Department of Housing? Hopefully just one agency, correct? All right, okay. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Any opposed? All right, ayes have it.